it's time to talk about Lent. We are back today with my colleague Fraser Pierce, two Lutheran pastors, having a bit of a chat about Lent. So, Fraser, these days in our society here in Australia, if people know much about Lent, it's probably to the extent of, the supermarkets still sometimes have a bit of a special on fish coming into Fridays, and maybe the chocolate eggs are starting to appear on the shelves because it's leading up to Easter. Maybe a few people like having pancakes just before Lent begins. But what is Lent really all about for Christians?
Well, Lent as a kind of church season is the 40 days before Easter, not including Sundays.
Mm-hmm.
The idea
it's quite
really
confusing how you count this. I was trying to explain it to people,
Right.
but yeah.
Yeah, but you can't really have a fast day on a Sunday, I think, is the basic idea. And 40 days, a big number, 40 in scriptures, in particular when it comes to Lent. We think of Jesus in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights, fasting, right?
So it's our preparation time for Easter.
It is, that's
basically,
right.
to celebrate the resurrection. So that's what it is. But how do Christians make the most of Lent? What are we supposed to be doing during Lent?
Well, there are traditions associated with Lent that we hear about really on Ash Wednesday, today, the first
We're recording
day,
on Ash Wednesday,
the first day of Lent. And every Ash Wednesday we hear teaching from the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus gives about, well, it's hard to know exactly how to translate the word from Greek, our deeds of piety, our acts of devotion, something like this.
This is Matthew chapter 6,
That's
right?
exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting because in the Sermon on the Mount, first of all, Jesus starts with the Beatitudes. He's speaking to his disciples, evidently in the presence of the crowds. And then he goes on to say to them, let your good works be seen by others so that they may glorify your Father in heaven. Let your light shine.
This is a salt and light passage.
Exactly right. So very strong teaching about letting your good works be seen. And he'll mention things like how we speak with each other, honouring each other with our words, fidelity in marriage, praying for people who persecute you, this sort of stuff.
Loving your enemies.
That's right. He wants this in his church to be seen, right? Because if people see this behaviour among Christians, they'll give glory to the Father. But then in chapter 6, he changes gear. He talks about these exercises of piety or devotional practice or acts of righteousness, which are to be done privately, secretly even, only before the Father. And he mentions three specific things: fasting, almsgiving, and prayer. And I think contextually, devotional prayer. And certainly Jesus talks about it as prayer literally behind closed doors, when no one is there, only the Father sees. And so you have these three practices that are traditionally therefore associated with Lent. Fasting, giving up of some good for the sake of a better good. We could talk about that if you like. Almsgiving, helping people in need with what we have. And devotional prayer. I think he's here not talking about what we do on Sunday with the congregation, but what we do in the privacy of our own homes, shutting the door, praying to the Father who sees in secret.
And so we could obviously go into quite some depth on each of these, but perhaps we'll do other videos on those in due course. What particularly for today I think could be helpful to focus on is what can each of these in turn, each of these three acts of piety that Jesus talks about, what can they actually look like for Christians today in Lent? So when the church says these are the things that we're going to take from Jesus and focus on for Lent, but what shape can that actually take in the lives of individual Christians in Australia or wherever you're watching in the 21st century? And what have you seen in people's lives that can be helpful along these lines?
Well, a simple thing with fasting could be, let's say you skip a meal one day, right? And you think, well, I'm going to fast. So normally you may have gone out and bought a hot dog and a drink. You think, well, today I'm not going to do that. I'm going to fast from lunch of a hot dog. And that leaves you with the money that you didn't spend on the meal, which you can then use to give to someone in need. And also it leaves you with time that you normally spend on lunch, and you can spend some time in prayer. The three things are connected traditionally too. Money and prayer are connected to fasting, because when you fast, you usually have more of both of those two things, right? And so it can mean something like giving up a meal, or sometimes, giving up one aspect of what one eats or drinks. Many people, for example, would give up alcohol during Lent. Alcohol is a good thing, but it can become a master, right? And so you give that up. Again, that leaves you with more money. You can use this for almsgiving. One which I'd recommend to people these days is social media. I think many people are enslaved to social media, and a Lenten time can be a good time to kind of cleanse from this, right?
Yeah.
And it also leaves them with more time, much more, for
Yes.
devotional prayer.
Yes.
Right?
That's interesting you mentioned that, because I was teaching our young people the other day on the first commandment, and we were talking about what it means to have a God, something you set your heart on. And I said some questions that can be helpful for identifying the false gods in our lives are questions like, what can I not do without? Or what do I even feel like if I don't have that, life's not worth living, And they said immediately, when we go on camps at school, all of the kids say, I'm going to die if I don't have my phone. They won't let me take my phone on camp. I'm going to die. This is literally what they say. And of course, kids can be dramatic in all of this, but they themselves could recognize this as a huge idol, particularly in our age, particularly for young people. And hence something that can be helpful to fast from in Lent. The other part of this was that some of the other kids in the group spoke about when they were forced to go on camp and not take their phones, they actually experienced a sense of freedom.
Right.
And this was incredibly perceptive, I thought, from these young people, because I've had this same experience in Lent sometimes, that actually intentionally taking the opportunity to fast from something. It can be very difficult, of course,
right.
but there can also be a sense that of freedom at times, that this thing that you realise has had a bit of mastery over you in some way.
Right. And so social media is a good example of that, it seems to me.
Yeah.
So I think food can be, alcohol or other drink can be as well,
Yeah.
other forms of entertainment. Right?
Yeah. And obviously, as you said, this leaves you with more money in your pocket to look for people in need,
Right.
as Jesus encourages, but all the while not letting your left hand know what your right hand is doing.
Right.
Is encouragement there. Can you go back as well to this distinction with prayer, this other aspect? So you mentioned that, to your mind, what Jesus describes in Matthew 6, what he encourages us to do in secret, is different from what we do on Sunday. Do you want us to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I mean, if you're listening into this, think about it and see what you reckon from your reading of Scripture. But, we know that Jesus had the custom of going to the synagogue every Sabbath, right? Mm-hmm. And he evidently and clearly engaged in public prayer.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Where other people would see him. And,
yeah. I assume also, by the way, that he would have engaged in public fasting as well, because the Jews would have had fast days, which I assume he would have kept,
right.
judging by his other behaviour.
Right.
And no problem with that. So I think even having public fasts in a congregation is not in itself problematic. Recently I went to a service at an Orthodox church on a Friday evening, and they had a meal offered afterwards, which was a simple vegetarian meal, because they were having a kind of fast that day, and everyone got into it, it was fine. So I think these sorts of activities, these communal activities are good. I think they become problematic when people say that you must do them. I think there's a bit more latitude there as it happens, or at least, we should be careful about, making laws out of these things. And nevertheless, I think communal activities of these sorts can be very good. There's a distinction between these and then privately chosen acts. And so I think an example perhaps would be in marriage. I wear a wedding ring, and I want everyone to know that I'm married, right? And this is a good thing, I think, and I want to speak about my wife in ways that honour her and show that we're married, all this sort of stuff. But let's suppose I call my wife by the affectionate term schmoopy whoopy. I think it's probably best kept behind closed doors. And imagine if I only called her schmoopy whoopy in public, but behind closed doors didn't speak with her.
Yeah, right.
There'd be a clear problem.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. Yeah.
So I think this is what Jesus is talking about with people who fast only when other people are watching them, or pray only when others are watching. Behind closed doors, silence and feasting. Right? What's actually going on?
Yeah. Yeah, a couple of things I just wanted to mention about these practices as well is just the way that we, here in our congregation, one of the ways this works out practically for people is that we have, as many congregations do, midweek Lenten services. So 6 p.m. each Wednesday evening during Lent. And at the end of those, we have the custom of a retiring offering, which is not part of our regular congregation offerings, but is essentially for the poor in one form or another. And so it's interesting to me that it's at 6 o'clock, so it's often around the time that people would be having dinner, potentially. And so one way that I think about it very practically for people here, and this could work out in your context as well, is that, okay, let's say that the service, the evening or midweek service, it holds you off at least for eating for a period of time, potentially. You have time in prayer, at the end, there's a retiring offering for the poor. And actually, it seems to me this tradition in the church is aimed at one way of living this out in a very simple way. The other thing I remember that's been helpful I got from you somewhere along the line was just very practically for people sometimes to write these things down.
You're
Right. So we haven't done this year, but in the past we've had a handbook, and I think it actually had sections just saying, it's not you're not making a contract that you need to feel too guilty about if it doesn't go completely to plan, but it can be helpful just for human beings to say, this is what I'm doing for Lent.
Yeah.
This time for prayer, fasting,
I'll have those handbooks out tonight, in fact,
Right.
and they're on the church's website too.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
I got it from an American Lutheran church and adapted it for use in Australia because our seasons are different. There are different customs, but
Yeah, but I'd certainly encourage that for people, that if you, in my own experience, I've had all sorts of ideas and thoughts and plans about making the most of Lent, but like many things in life, it can be helpful for us just to actually put something down a bit more concrete. And if you've never tried these things before, don't go over the top, start simple, that sort of wisdom.
Right.
But yeah, here we are, making the most of Lent.
A couple more things I've made very briefly. I mean, of course, in all things, love. So you never, recommend fasting to somebody who's actually, in a medically difficult
thanks for
situation
mentioning this.
or pregnant, perhaps, or other things like this, right? Or little children. So I think, you have to think maturely about this, it seems to me.
Absolutely.
And one more thing, it's interesting that in this teaching, Jesus brings up explicitly and repeatedly appeals to reward from the Father who sees in secret. I think sometimes we downplay this too. From a Christian point of view, from the Lord's point of view, doing these things is a good spiritual investment that the Father will reward. It's not how we become God's children. I think it's very clear that it's not how we become God's children, but as God's children, this is a great path of reward from the Father. And Jesus makes this very clear.
Yeah, and to my mind, this is significant in tying in with that whole theme in Matthew 6 of being seen, because I look at my children when they do things, and they have this deep desire to be seen. Look at me, Dad. Look at me. Look what's going on, right? And we have that as human beings. The problem is, to my mind, where it's directed. So the problem is we try to do things to be seen by other people. Now, sometimes we're tempted to say, you shouldn't need to do it to be seen. Just do it because it's a good thing. And it's strange to some modern minds. That's not what Jesus says. He says, no. The impulse to be seen is just there. It's where it's directed. Do it to be seen by the Father, and He'll reward you.
Right.
Wow. It's quite a tremendous encouragement as we embark on Lenten disciplines.
Yeah, it's good to want to have an investment that gives good returns from this point of view.
Yeah.
But where can you invest
Right.
that you get good returns?
Right. So, blessed Lent to you all. Blessed Lent to you, Fraser. Yeah, thanks for being on Kairos again today, and God bless you. See you later.